I'm Karen Chapman. I'm the Planning and Development Director at Montechusett Regional Planning Commission. And it's great to have you here. We have Chris Kluchman and Nate Carlucci from DHCD's Community Services Division to talk about MBTA communities and the requirements of the new law. The PowerPoint for this session will be emailed to everyone who registered today. It will be emailed out tomorrow. We're going to have about 25 minutes of presentation, and if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A and we will ask the questions after. And that's it. So we'll turn it over to Nate and Chris. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here in front of all of the board members that have been able to make it tonight. My name is Chris Kluchman. I'm the Deputy Director at the Division of Local Services at DHCD. And my colleague Nate Carlucci and I are going to go through a PowerPoint. And as Karen said, we'll send this out to you. It is a fairly dense PowerPoint with lots of information in it, but don't worry, you'll be receiving a full copy of it. So you'll have all the text. Nate, when you're ready, we'll start the presentation. And so we'd like to go through the presentation and then we'll turn to the Q&A session after we're done. So Nate, if you want to go to the full screen presentation, if you can.
It should be on the full screen now.
Okay, I'm seeing the panel on the left, but that's okay. We can get started if you want. We can just go to the next slide. But I am seeing the slides on the left.
I have it set on the full screen.
Okay.
Apologies to everybody. I don't know what else to do.
Can you advance to the next slide?
It is, yeah.
I am just seeing the title slide and the slides to the left.
Sorry, folks, I'm going to back out and re-share this. I don't know why it is not sharing the proper screen here.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. We'll get going in just one second. There we go. Awesome. That's perfect. Thank you. So we'd like to start this presentation by reminding folks about the housing crisis that Massachusetts is in. And we start with a little bit of data, but I think everybody on this presentation understands that prices in Eastern Massachusetts are very high. And this the next couple slides are just going to document that just in case you weren't sure, or in case the boards or the town in which you're in, this isn't common information. Sorry, Nate, now I've lost the slides.
Having some software and computer issues here. Sorry, folks.
Okay, never mind. It's okay. I'm just going to talk to some of these slides. So Massachusetts, and we think because primarily the lack of housing production is one of the main reasons that we have high housing prices. We are unfortunately towards the high end, and here this chart, which I can see now, Nate, is showing where Massachusetts is the 4th highest in home values in the country. These are all the states in the country, and also 4th highest in rents as of last summer. And again, primarily we see this as a lack of housing production. Between 1960 and 1990, the state produced almost 900,000 housing units. But between 1990 and 2020, the next 30-year period, the state only produced just under 500,000, or almost half as much. And so our production of new housing units has fallen drastically in the last generation. Let's go to the next slide, Nate. And that's unfortunately one of the reasons that we see these high housing prices. And the other thing that this has to do, and we're going to be talking about a law that changes zoning, but housing prices are linked to the Commonwealth's economic competitiveness. And one of the things that we see as a result of such high housing prices is that our economy and folks and the workforce that we need to make our economy thrive are seeking cheaper housing locations. This chart shows how the greater Boston region compares to other metro regions in terms of the amount of production of new housing units per 1,000 residents. And so as you can see, again, here, Massachusetts is shown in red. It's not a high value here. We're very low value in terms of producing a low amount of new housing units per 1,000 residents. And what this means is that the high housing prices are driving our workforce, whether it's homegrown or people looking for work, to these other places. They're producing many, many more housing units than we are, and their housing is then much cheaper. And so this is a problem with retaining talent and housing the workforce that we have here today. Next slide. So in 2020, 2021, the legislature and then the governor signed the Economic Development Bond Bill that created the MBTA Communities Law, and amended Section 3A of Chapter 40A, the Zoning Act. We feel this law is a game changer. It is something that asks 175 municipalities in Eastern Massachusetts to zone for multifamily housing as of right, near transit, if transit exists, and for those communities that don't have transit, to find a good location in your community and to allow for multifamily housing. The requirement in Section 3A requires zoning, not production. And my colleague Nate is going to tell you a little bit more about that in the future, in the next couple slides. But we do think that this is a really important way to solve one piece of the housing puzzle. Housing production, again, is only one piece of the housing economics and the greater, the housing market, but it is an important one. And we feel this is very important to remove barriers to new multifamily housing. Next slide. So this is just a brief overview of what has happened since that's the governor's signing on January 14th, 2021. When he signed the law, it actually went into effect right away, and we pretty much issued preliminary guidance that gave folks, until we developed guidelines, space from the law. Just about a year ago, we issued the draft guidelines and entered into a public comment period that lasted for just a little bit over 3 months. We received almost 400 comments and made many changes based on those comments when we issued the guidelines in August of this year, in 2022. Generally, people were happy about the guidelines and the stance that they took, but we also heard a lot of details about how applying the rules that we had outlined in the draft guidelines on the ground, and in particular in smaller communities, would be difficult. So we did make some changes and into the guidelines that were issued in August. And since then have had many fewer comments and critiques. And folks in general have been rolling up their sleeves and figuring out how they're going to comply. This past November, we issued a kind of second piece of the guidelines, which is a compliance model, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And the first deadline we've put on this slide, which is when action plans are due. And we'll be spending time in the presentation talking about what those action plans are and other deadlines that apply to MBTA communities. And I'm going to pass it on now to my colleague Nate, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the statute and the guidelines that we've developed from them.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to get into some of the details of the program guidelines for Section 3A. It's certainly important to start with the context of the guidelines, which would be the statute, Section 3A of the Zoning Act, which is actually pretty brief. So the guidelines largely are an interpretation of the language and the terms that are in the statute here. So as you can see, the statute consists of 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is essentially the zoning substance of Section 3A. And again, it has a lot of terms that are defined and interpreted in the guidelines, such as what is an MBTA community? What does it mean for a zoning district to be of reasonable size? How do you deal with the requirement that a zoning district be located not more than a half mile from a transit station, if applicable? The second paragraph of the statute names the funding sources that are at stake in terms of compliance with the statute. And finally, the third paragraph tasks DHCD with developing the program's guidelines. So the first question you might ask is, what is an MBTA community? MBTA communities were a pre-existing thing. They are the communities that are in the MBTA service district. They're named in the MBTA statute, chapter 161A. There's obviously a lot of diversity between 175 plus different communities. So one of the first things that the guidelines do is they divide the MBTA communities into 4 what we call community categories: rapid transit, commuter rail, adjacent, and adjacent small town. Each of those categories has different formulas that are used to determine their requirements. I do also want to mention, when you think about what is an MBTA community, there's a good rule of thumb, even though it's a little bit imperfect in a couple different exception scenarios. By and large, these are the communities that either have a fixed transit asset within their boundaries. That's an MBTA fixed transit asset, like a MBTA commuter rail station or rapid transit station, or a community that abuts one that does have one. In defining these different community categories, there's an important concept to understand, and that's the concept of developable station area. When we define what community category an MBTA community belongs to, we don't just use the presence of a transit station. We actually look a little bit deeper to see that a transit station is surrounded by developable land that basically makes that area suitable for zoning for multifamily housing. So we have a threshold of 100 acres of developable station area associated with a transit station in order to give rise to a community category. So for example, a community that has at least 100 acres of developable station area from a rapid transit station will be a rapid transit community. Same thing with commuter rail. If a community has 100 acres or more of developable station area from a commuter rail station, then that community is a commuter rail community. When a community satisfies multiple definitions, it falls into the higher level requirement category. Just about half of all the MBTA communities, though, don't have 100 acres of developable station area. Those are one form or another of adjacent communities. An adjacent community is a community that has less than 100 acres of developable station area. And if that community also has either no more than 7,000 residents, year-round residents, or has a population density of less than 500 people per square mile, then that community is an adjacent small town. This table here lays out the basic differences in the requirements for each of the community categories. The first thing that we deal with is the reasonable size requirement. The statute requires that MBTA communities have a zoning district of reasonable size. The guidelines interpret reasonable size to consist of 2 factors. One of them is land area, the other is unit capacity. So land area is obviously just the physical size of the district. And in most cases, a community's minimum land area requirement is 50 acres. When you picture 50 acres, it's the size of Boston Common. It represents a good area for neighborhood scale planning. And it's actually about 1/10 of the land area that would be within a 1/2 mile radius of a transit station. There are some exceptions to the minimum land area requirement. For example, adjacent small towns are not subject to a minimum land area requirement. There are, in other cases, limitations to minimum land area requirements for communities that have, for example, small total sizes or small amounts of total developable land in their communities. There's a cap that no community is required to have a land area of more than 1.5% of its total developable land. The second component of the reasonable size requirement is the multifamily unit capacity, which is essentially the number of multifamily units that could be developed based on the zoning that's in place. And so we use a formula to determine the community's minimum unit capacity requirement. And this is a basic rule. There are some exceptions to it, but essentially what the formula does is it takes the 2020 housing stock from the decennial census and multiplies it by the factor you see listed in row 2 of this table. So for example, for a commuter rail community, you would take the 2020 housing stock and you would multiply it by 15% to determine the community's minimum unit capacity requirement. There are differences in the location requirements based on the community category. There is actually no specific district location requirement for adjacent communities or adjacent small towns. Rapid transit communities and commuter rail communities are required to locate at least a portion of their districts in certain proximity to their transit stations. I'll go into a little bit more detail on a following slide, but when you think back to the language in the statute that says these districts must be located within a half mile of a transit station where applicable, this is what that requirement's getting at. And finally, the compliance deadlines vary based on the community categories. The rapid transit communities have the quickest turnaround time for their district compliance. That's at the end of 2023. Commuter rail and adjacent communities, which that's actually most MBTA communities, have a deadline at the end of 2024. And finally, the adjacent small towns have a deadline at the end of 2025. I do want to talk about unit capacity in a little bit more detail. We get a lot of questions about the impact of existing development on the measurement of a community's unit capacity. So I want to emphasize that the unit capacity relates to zoning and not to development or production. So if you look at the example on the bottom of this slide, you have a parcel that has an existing duplex on it. That duplex is actually irrelevant to the calculation of that parcel's unit capacity. What you do is you look at the zoning and you treat the parcel as if it's undeveloped. So in this case, if the zoning says that this parcel can accommodate 4 units, then its unit capacity is 4, regardless of whether there's a duplex on it now, or even regardless of whether there were 10 units on it now. It's just based on the zoning. So this unit capacity would be 4. To get into some of the district location requirements, I'm going to use a couple examples of MBTA communities. The first example is Arlington. Arlington is actually an adjacent community, and the reason for that is because Arlington has less than 100 acres of developable station area. You can see on the map on the right, in the bottom right-hand corner of Arlington there, they have a little bit of developable station area that's coming from Alewife Station in Cambridge, but it's only 58 acres. So you know that they don't have that 100-acre threshold, so they don't have a district location requirement. And you could also determine that by looking at the table on the left, which is taken from the guidelines. And this table is used to determine the exact percentage of a district that needs to be located within that half-mile radius of the transit station. So a very different example would be Needham. Needham has 4 commuter rail stations. Those result in a ton of developable station area, over 1,200 acres. So to determine Needham's district location requirement, you look again at that table 2 on the left, and you see that for communities with at least 800 acres of developable station area, they need to locate 90% of their district within that 1/2 mile radius of developable station area. And when you think about that 90% requirement, that refers to both 90% of the minimum land area requirement and 90% of the minimum unit capacity. That requirement is a little bit different conceptually than our district contiguity requirements. There are a couple of contiguity requirements. One of them is that 50% of the total district size needs to be contiguous. And the reason I want to highlight that is because I just mentioned for meeting the district location requirements, that requirement is tied to the minimum requirements. So if, for example, 50% of a district had to be located within the half-mile radius of a transit station, that means 50% of its minimum acreage. But in this case, for contiguity, that 50% of the district size refers to the actual adopted district size. So if the district was like 500 acres, then 250 acres would have to be contiguous. There's a second requirement with contiguity, and that is that no non-contiguous portion of a district can be less than 5 acres in order to count towards a minimum district size requirement. And that's, again, to focus on kind of the neighborhood scale planning of this program, rather than just zoning individual small parcels. There's one exception to that 5-acre threshold, and that's for, like an adjacent small town community that can meet its entire unit capacity requirement with less than 5 acres. So I do want to talk about what multifamily housing actually is, and that is now defined in the Zoning Act in the definitions section. The definition of multifamily housing can be met in 2 ways. One of them is the common one, with a building of 3 or more residential dwelling units, but it can also technically be met by having 2 duplexes on the same lot. And when we think about what kinds of multifamily housing are required under this program, I want to focus on the graphic at the bottom of this slide. This program is trying to allow that missing middle housing types. So when you look at the bottom graphic, it's like a scale, and on the left you see the detached single family homes, which would not qualify, of course, as multifamily housing. And then all the way on the right, you see the mid-rise development. That's also not what this program is targeting for multifamily housing. There's a gross density requirement of 15 units per acre. That's district-wide. And when, by and large, when you take that gross density of 15 units per acre, you're really getting at the types of housing that you see pictured here in the missing middle housing type. Of course, the program does require that the multifamily housing is allowed as of right. And as of right presents a lot of questions about what kinds of requirements can be attached to permitting while still staying consistent with the as of right requirement. So on this slide, we have a few of the common topics that come up when we think about as of right zoning. One of them is site plan review. Site plan review is allowed as part of the permitting process, as long as that site plan review does not impose unreasonable requirements or undue delays or anything like that. A very popular topic is affordability, and we'll get to more detail on affordability in a following slide. But I do want to highlight that we made some revisions relatively recently in October to allow communities to require more affordability in their districts than what was allowed when these guidelines were first released. By and large, the rule is that a community can require that up to 10% of units at 80% of area median income have to be affordable units. And there are a couple exceptions in place that allow communities to require more affordability. One of them is by going through another program, another DHCD program, such as Chapter 40R, and another is by submitting an economic feasibility analysis. A lot of communities use they want to see mixed use development in the same neighborhoods where these 3A districts are going to be located. And I do want to emphasize that when it comes to mixed use development, it can be allowed, it can even be incentivized, but it cannot be mandatory. And the reason for that is that the statute actually defines separately multifamily housing from mixed use development, and it requires that multifamily housing itself as a standalone use be allowed as of right. And finally, I just want to mention on energy efficiency. There's just a requirement that multifamily housing cannot be required to meet higher standards than other uses in the municipality, such as single family housing. So just to get into a little bit more detail on the affordability requirements or allowances, if you want to think of it that way. Again, the community can require up to 10% of units at 80% AMI automatically. Communities can require more affordability with a limit of 20% of units and can go below 80% AMI if they're going through another DHCD program, such as 40R, or if the community submits an economic feasibility analysis to support those requirements. There are a couple more details. One is that for a community that has an existing 40R district that requires up to 25% of units to be affordable, those requirements can stay in place and the district can even be amended to meet the other zoning requirements of this program. And I want to mention that when it comes to the economic feasibility studies, this is a relatively new change to the program requirements, and we are going to be giving you a little bit more detail on the specific requirements of that feasibility study. We also, as part of those changes, removed a previous requirement that required any affordable units in the 3A districts to be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory. We removed that requirement because its removal allows communities to require workforce housing. That's housing with area median incomes over 80%. And finally, while we're talking about affordability, I just want to emphasize the importance of being aware of the Chapter 40B requirements to get on the subsidized housing inventory, and more specifically, what the requirements are for as of right multifamily housing as local action units. Finally, I just want to talk about the compliance timelines here. We've had a couple of different phases of essentially this interim compliance that we're in right now. You might notice in the statute, there is no effective date. So technically when the statute came to be, every community was already subject to these requirements. But through the guidelines, we created a little bit of relief from the strict requirements. For 2022, there was an opportunity to submit a community information form, and communities that submitted that form remained eligible for the funding sources that are named in the statute. And we had a very high compliance rate with that community information form. Around 95% of all communities returned it. In 2023, the opportunity to achieve an interim compliance comes from submitting an action plan. Action plans have a due date for all community categories of January 31st, 2023. It's a pretty easy form. I really encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, to take a look at it at our webpage, mass.gov/MBTA communities. The form generally asks communities to share what their schedule is for developing compliant zoning. Communities that do submit that action plan will be able to achieve interim compliance up until their deadline for their full district compliance, and remain eligible for the funding sources in the statute during that time. But I would mention that for communities that apply for some of the grant funding through DHCD programs, that we will look to make sure that those communities are taking some action in relation to the steps that were outlined on their action plan. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chris.
Thanks so much, Nate. And I should have started with just an acknowledgement. Nate, if you want to go to the next page, I want to acknowledge to everybody that this is a new program, and it is difficult when we're faced with new requirements and new things to learn. Many of you on boards have become very good at understanding Chapter 40A, the Zoning Act, understanding Chapter 40B, understanding what the subsidized housing inventory is, understanding the smart growth overlay districts, which we call Chapter 40R. And I just want to acknowledge to all of you that it just is tough. You know, if you put yourself back to when Chapter 40B was first put in place 50 years ago, everybody was struggling to understand the rules just like you guys are right now. And I just want to let you know, one of the things I'm going to be talking about is technical assistance. We understand in our role here at DHCD, as with our partners in the regional planning agencies and our quasi-public agencies, such as Massachusetts Housing Partnership, where Katie Lacey works, we all understand the need to help folks understand the rules and then be able to apply the rules. So I just wanted to start with that. So we released in November the compliance model, and the compliance model has 3 pieces and honestly can be its own session just on that. So we're happy to try and answer any questions about the compliance model, but understand that your regional planning agencies and consultants have been trained on how to use it. It does require a geographic information system called GIS in order to locate a district in your community. We have provided what are called land maps, which are GIS files on the website for every one of the MBTA communities. So those can be downloaded, and they include all the parcels in your community, and they're tagged with, as you can see on the left here, what are definitions in the guidelines, such as excluded land areas, sensitive land areas, and then you define where you think the district will be, whether it's an existing district like residential 3, or if you're going to do a new district like an overlay. Once that area is defined on a map, you can export all of the parcels that are within that district, and then that goes into an Excel spreadsheet. The model is effectively a very complex Excel spreadsheet. So that spreadsheet is what we expect folks at the local level really to be using, whether you get assistance from your regional planning agency or a consultant to work with you to define the geographic area of the district. You then will have all of the parcels into a workbook. The second piece of the compliance model in this Excel workbook is a zoning checklist. And that zoning checklist asks you at the local level to put in several key metrics that will help provide an estimate of the unit capacity. So this is the official tool that will provide you with the unit capacity estimate, which is required in the guidelines. So that zoning checklist will ask about minimum lot size. It'll ask about lot coverage. It'll ask about height. If you have floor area ratio, it'll ask about floor area ratio. It'll ask a bunch of key metrics or measurements that zoning contains that are about what your multifamily district would allow. Those metrics that are put in will then be applied against all of the parcels that are in the district. And then that will create, at the end, answers to the questions that we ask, such as what is the district size? What is the estimated unit capacity? What is the density? And then if you have a transit station in your district, it will also show you how much of the area and unit capacity are present in that station area. If you remember the map of Needham, where Needham has a very high percentage, this tool will allow you to calculate that, and it will calculate it for you. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, it is showing a compliant district, but it's certainly possible that in the first time you look at this, you choose a district, you put in your zoning metrics, you may not get yeses. This is showing, it's green for go, and it's showing a district that would meet these compliance factors. It may happen the first time you run this model that it will come up with the size is right, but your unit capacity still isn't quite as much as you need to show. Maybe your gross density is good, and maybe you have enough area and enough land and unit capacity in the station areas, but you so it may be an iterative process in which you go through to determine the location of your district, if it has to be larger, if perhaps you may need you may want to consider different densities or sub-districts within a district that would allow for higher or higher density near a station, I'm thinking higher height, but higher density near a transit station or near bus lines if you happen to have bus lines, and then lower density in other places. So it is potentially an iterative process, but it is a required tool. And much of the technical assistance that we have is geared towards helping communities use this tool. Next slide, Nate. So just a quick overview of all of the technical assistance. As I mentioned, we're very aware that this new program is new to everybody, and everybody is working on how to achieve it. So it is our goal to provide every community that wants technical assistance with technical assistance. We're very lucky right now. We're in a place where we have funding to enable us to do this across a variety of sources. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about exactly where you can get those resources in a bit. But we are working across agencies and also working with our regional our partners in the regional planning agencies to make sure that folks get the assistance that they want. Nate mentioned the action plan as one of the things that's coming up in about a month and a half. That's its deadline. If you have questions about the action plan, I would recommend a webinar that Nate did in the Mass Housing Partnerships webinar series on October 19th, where he walks through in a very detailed way what the action plan, what is being requested in the action plan, and how to fill it out. We're working on a sample bylaw and ordinance and a how-to guide. These are all things that will be posted later in January. Next slide. So I'm going to start with our partners, Mass Housing Partnership, who have put together a fantastic array of technical assistance resources. I mentioned the webinar series. There were 10 webinars of a whole variety of topics, and I really commend those to you. If you have not seen them, they're up on their website. The link is here, and again, you're going to get this slide deck, so you'll be able to have this link, and they cover an array of topics from how to fill out an action plan to 15-minute neighborhoods to how you might design streets within a compact neighborhood within your MBTA community's neighborhood and zoning, to a whole variety of different topics that may help not only you understand in a technical way what the requirements are, but more importantly, how to communicate that with the public, because that will be a challenge for everybody at the local level. Through DHCD, I oversee 3 different grant programs in this year's grant round that just was awarded in this past fall. We're spending almost $800,000 across 14 communities to assist them to comply with Section 3A. Our colleagues at the Executive Office of Environment and Energy Affairs has a grant program called the Land Use Planning Grant Program. They have awarded 5 communities with funding to pursue 3A compliance, and they will open that up again next year, as will I, with the 3 programs, the Community Planning, Housing Choice, and Rural and Small Town. And then finally, the regional planning agencies have already started working with communities through their district local technical assistance funding, and many of them are opening up those technical assistance programs at the beginning of the calendar year, where the program staff in municipalities should be pretty familiar with how to seek technical assistance. And so those are our resources. In addition to the webinars that Mass Housing Partnership had, just as going back up to MHP for a second, they also are have awarded approximately 50 communities technical assistance grants, where they're going to be providing consultants to help those 50 communities. And that will be a program that will be ongoing over time. Last slide, please. So this was a relatively quick overview of Section 3A. We hope that you've learned a little bit more about it. We hope that you've learned a little bit more about some of the tools like the compliance model and some of the technical assistance resources. I already put in the chat the mass.gov website or web pages where we have tons of information, but please do bookmark mass.gov/MBTA communities. That's kind of the landing page. But if you bookmark that page, that's where many resources will be, including the resources that we will continue to post, such as slide decks like this, such as recordings that talk about the compliance model, the sample bylaw and ordinance, etc. And so that is a website that you want to kind of keep coming back to. And I think, Nate, at this point, we're going to just take the slide deck down and we're going to answer some of your questions.
All right, great. So let's see, the first question, has the Mass population increased at a rate greater than the increase in housing units?
The Massachusetts population in the last 2 decades has increased, both through natural, through births, outpacing deaths, and through immigration. But it is the population has grown and the housing has not grown to support it. And I can't tell you the exact statistics for the last couple years, but what I can say is looking back over the generation of underproduction has really put it, we're in a hole right now. So it kind of almost doesn't matter what we're producing right now. We're already in a big hole where we just have not enough supply to meet the population, regardless of how fast Massachusetts population is growing or not.
Great, thank you. From Elizabeth. In Manchester, Mass, the train station and trail rails will be underwater by 2070. Sections of the train line between Boston and Manchester will be underwater well before 2070. This is in accordance with various municipal vulnerability plans prepared by Manchester and abutting communities. How should the town approach the half-mile requirement for housing when the downtown is vulnerable to flooding?
Well, I understand that the MBTA community's requirements and future projected areas, sensitive land areas, may seem to be in conflict. We are coordinating closely with our partners in the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, but they agree with us that putting housing and zoning, removing zoning barriers for housing near transit is still going to be a way that we're going to reduce greenhouse gases. Manchester has a minimum land area of 37 acres and a 40% requirement near its station. You may have provisions so that when production comes, there may be elevated heights that you want to put in place, but we do still think that you should provide for the zone, and you must provide for the zoning. I do understand that these can seem like conflicting directions, but we are all working together to put housing in the best place. And if the station area is not the best place, again, you don't have to put all of the zoning district in that station area. You might look for other areas that will be less vulnerable. Nate, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that you pretty much covered it, and I just encourage a lot of communities to consider that the guidelines offer a lot of flexibility in terms of the district location requirements. There are some communities that have that 90% location requirement, but for just about anybody else, there's a lot of opportunity to satisfy the requirement with one portion of the district and then locate a lot of the districts elsewhere.
Great. I believe this one's for you, Nate. Please define developable.
Okay, so this one, to some extent, it depends on the context of the word developable, which can appear in multiple places within the guidelines. For example, the word developable comes in developable station area. And in that context, we're talking about the developable land within 1/2 mile of a transit station. And the question's probably getting more towards what is developable land. which is also a little bit complex. And I would certainly encourage you to look for the definitions in the guidelines for a very specific answer to that question. In a general sense, when we're talking about developable land, the word developable is talking about lands on which multifamily housing could be permitted and constructed. So there's a couple times when that is not the case. For example, if a parcel is full of wetlands, then the wetlands are what we call excluded land, and we don't consider multifamily housing to be a possibility for development on that parcel. There are also other circumstances when you think about, for example, institutional or public land, where parcels that are in those categories are not developable for multifamily housing in the private sector. So there's a couple other examples of when land is not developable. And I do want to note too that definition also affects the calculation of gross density in a zoning district. So without getting too far into the weeds of what is excluded land, I'd encourage communities in general to, again, look in the definitions of excluded land and see this might happen while you're using the compliance model in a scenario building process, and see what is the impact of actually including those excluded lands within the district or not including them within the district. We really tried to strike a good balance in the guidelines of making it easy to draw a district, but also noting the way that gross density is calculated based on the definition in section 48. There are certain times when excluded land, you might think of that as undevelopable land, is included in the density denominator for calculating gross density. So there are times when it'll be impactful to choose between including or not including land that you would not call developable.
Great, thank you. Let's see, how does a community without a sewer system deal with such density?
I'll take this one, let Nate catch his breath. So what we're asking communities to do and what the law requires is to provide zoning at a certain density. Much of this density can be served by standard septic, and it can be served by wastewater treatment facilities. And so that is really on the project's developer once the zoning is in place. So it is possible that in a standard septic situation that you may be a community that zones for 15 units a gross acre, and the development that you get may be less than that because somebody has to put in a leach field and has to have separation between the septic field and a well. Let's say you don't have any water system either. And that may mean that you ultimately get a little bit less density, but what you've done is you've removed the zoning barriers to doing that. And so, you know, that 15 unit an acre may be 7 units an acre of townhouses, but it's still providing for that multifamily housing option that communities sorely need.
Okay, why are you insisting on using existing assessor parcels for compliance? Small lots aren't amenable to high density or provision of elevators. Developers usually combine lots.
I can take this one. So I think that really the essence when you think about section 3A and its primary purpose, it's that a developer can come in and develop multifamily housing as of right. So in order to determine whether the developer can develop multifamily housing as of right, we need to compare the zoning district to the parcels that are in the zoning district. So if the parcel was non-conforming with zoning, then a developer could not develop housing there as of right. So that's why we rely on what existing parcels are in order to sort of calculate those compliance metrics. And I do want to, in terms of the second part of this question, kind of go back to emphasizing the type of housing that this program is targeting for zoning, that missing middle housing. it's certainly, you know, conceivable that Section 3A will create opportunity for multifamily housing development on smaller lots. The definition in this case can be satisfied with just a 3-unit building. And it doesn't take a very large lot to accommodate that. Usually it's zoning that would be the obstacle to that development and not any sort of physical limitation. So what we're trying to do here is remove the zoning barrier to that development. And so this program is maybe less about lot aggregation and more about unlocking non-conforming lots for the development of missing middle housing.
Okay, will technical assistance grants be available for economic feasibility requirements?
That's a great question. We will be, one of the things that we're going to put out in January will be a standard scope of work that you could use to hire a consultant or work with your regional planning agency to conduct an economic feasibility analysis. And let me just be clear here, that's only required if you want to go beyond into deeper affordability, more than 10% of the units or lower than 80% of the area median income. So, so one thing is we're going to be providing a standard scope of work, and we're going to be providing criteria about what is required of an economic feasibility analysis. The DHCD programs, community planning, housing choice grants, and rural and small town grants will pay for an economic feasibility analysis consultant. And I'm not sure whether Katie Lacey's program will or not at Mass Housing Partnership, but we do want to try and make sure that folks understand and have access to that. But those, the next round of the DHCD grants are through the Community One Stop, which has just opened its expression of interest. And those, so if you have questions about that grant process and what those grants will fund, I suggest you go to mass.gov and then search on Community One Stop for Growth. That's a consolidated grant application program in which those 3 grant programs can be accessed. The application, so expression of interest is kind of like a pre-application phase where you can, communities can ask questions about the projects that they have in mind. And the application window is in May, with awards and funding available in late fall of 2023. So we've just kind of finished awarding the last year, the fiscal 23 round, and we'll open up the fiscal 24 will be about November. The funding would be available and awards announced in November, October, November 2023.
Can the multifamily housing require parking?
I can take this. Yes, there can be parking requirements, and in fact, the guidelines don't actually have any specific limitations on what those parking requirements are. However, the compliance model that Chris talked about that we're using to sort of determine or estimate unit capacity within a zoning district does take parking requirements into account. So the model estimates how much land area will be consumed by the required parking. So if you're going through the compliance model and doing some scenario building, you might see that if you input sort of onerous parking requirements, the district is going to be a lot less likely to meet its unit capacity requirements or its gross density requirements. And you can kind of play with the compliance model and maybe try reducing the parking requirements. And you'll see that once you reduce those, there's going to be more opportunity for units to actually be developed in the district. So the short answer is yes, you can have parking requirements, but it's definitely worth exploring the specific sort of numerical impact that the parking requirements have on potential unit capacity in the district.
Excellent. Could you provide more information on the process and requirements for creating a 40R district?
Sure. Very briefly, and again, what I'm going to suggest is that if you're really interested in this, you do a little research or work with your regional planning agency staff or a planner if you have one, but look at mass.gov/search on 40R. But a 40R district is called a smart growth overlay district, and they are overlay districts with certain requirements for density and affordability. It is a program that looks to locate this increased density near transit or in areas of concentrated development. And that's a big topic right there. And so there's a lot of information in the details of the program regulations, but it is something that it does require DHCD staff to review and approve an overlay district text prior to you going to your legislative body, such as town meeting or city or town council. And if it is approved by your legislative body, there are payments. And so there is some incentive. They're called zoning incentive payments that the state by statute is obligated to pay your community once you've successfully adopted a 40R district. Furthermore, if you get development in the 40R district, you may be eligible for payments for each unit that is developed. So there's kind of a two phase of financial incentives. Again, it is a program with a whole variety of rules and guidelines, so I encourage you to look at that if that's something that you'd like to use. We do think that there may be more communities who seek to use a 40R overlay district as a way to comply with Section 3A, but you do need to understand the complexities. Our colleagues, Bill Rayolt and Becca George at DHCD are the folks that staff that, but their information can be found on their web pages.
The town of Rockport doesn't have a planner. The planning board is comprised of volunteers. We will need significant help from a consultant to fully comply with these guidelines. Where can we get this assistance without actually hiring an outside consultant?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that question. I mean, one resource is going to be your regional planning agency, which is MAPC. They have a technical assistance program that I believe has its application period open right now. And so you may seek, through the MAPC website or through the regional folks that support you. You can seek that. Otherwise, there are the Mass Housing Partnership technical assistance program, which can be found through their website, www.mhp.net. They have gone through one round of applying technical assistance, but you can consult with them. They will provide you with the consultant, so you do not have to procure a consultant if you get funding, if you get assistance from them. But otherwise, the programs that I mentioned that are the DHCD programs, they are grants that would provide funding to your community, but you would have to procure a consultant. The state vendor list does have a whole variety of planning consultants on it, and we'd be happy to follow up with CPT staff to get you more information about that later. But so, one, you may have to hire a consultant, but there are resources, or you may get assistance from a consultant, but there are a variety of resources to get that consultant assistance, or perhaps you work with your regional planning agency staff.
Thank you, Chris. Is land in an AE flood zone considered undevelopable?
So it largely depends on local conditions. Actually, the guidelines don't specifically determine whether land in a flood zone is developable or not. But the key piece to keep in mind is that this program requires that the housing is allowed as of right, which means there cannot be a discretionary permit required. So for a lot of flood zones, development in a flood zone for a lot of municipalities, development in a flood zone requires a special permit. And in that case, that would be in conflict with Section 3A. In some communities, the flood zone permitting requirements do not amount to a special permit. They may have just a set of sort of objective criteria that need to be met in order to develop in a flood zone. And in those cases, development would be considered as of right. So it really depends on exactly what the flood zone requirements are in an individual community.
Thank you, Nate. Can a town have a minimum lot size requirement? For example, if the current lots in a district are quarter-acre lots, must the zone allow for, say, 4 to 5 housing units on the current lot, or could the town require a minimum lot size, say, of 1 acre?
So this is a little bit similar to the previous question about the assessor's parcels, I think. So of course, yes, you can have a minimum lot size requirement. I would note, though, that if that lot size requirement is larger than most of the parcels that are in the zoning district, it's going to be problematic in this calculation or the estimate of unit capacity. So again, the housing must be allowed as of right. But if you have non-conforming lots and there's a special permit or a variance required for development, then the unit capacity of those lots, which is measuring as of right unit capacity, is going to be 0. So I think when you're sort of figuring out what the minimum lot size requirement should be in a 3A district, it's really important to make sure that the majority of the parcels in the district are going to meet that minimum lot size requirement. Minimum lot sizes have really been a big barrier in municipalities throughout the region over the past several decades. So one of the purposes of Section 3A is again to sort of unlock those parcels for multifamily housing.
Thank you, Nate. How do you define a housing unit? Multiple 2-bedroom dwellings will have a different impact than multiple 4-bedroom dwellings, especially in a town with private water and septic.
So I'm not going to try to restate perfectly the definition of a unit right now, but I will say that we have a zoning requirement that relates to units and not bedrooms. And a developer can choose how many bedrooms are going to be in the unit, but I would encourage you to look at the requirements in terms of housing that is suitable for families with children. There is a prohibition on capping the number of units, for example. But I think I would also mention that again, and I think this came up in a previous question, but this Section 3A relates to zoning only. So where there is not public sewer or water, for example, we do recognize that the development in those districts is likely to be less than what the zoning actually allows, be less than what the program requires for the 15 units per acre of gross density.
Great. Would our community's creation of a 40R overlay district proximate to our downtown transit station satisfy the MBTA community's requirements, or would we still need to go through action plan step?
Thanks for asking the question, Mary Jo. I hope things are going well in Fitchburg for you. So we cannot say definitively that if the city adopted a 40R district, that it would meet all the requirements, because as we've shown through this presentation, and then if you read the guidelines, it's a combination of adopting zoning provisions that would comply, but also going through the compliance model to review is the city meeting its unit capacity and location requirements that are included in the guidelines. So we just can't say that just adopting a 40R district is going to do it. You have to make sure that you're also meeting the metrics that apply to the city of Fitchburg. So we can't give you an answer without looking at what that process is. I'm not sure if that was all of your question, but that's generally it. You're going to have to go through a process of looking at like the zoning in a 40R overlay district may be compliant, but you have to, like, the size of the district and what is its estimate of unit capacity would still have to be determined. Oh, I know. The second part was about the action plan. Again, we would recommend that everybody complete an action plan by January 31st, 2023 to hold you harmless from the penalties in the statute that call out 3 funding sources that the community would then be ineligible for.
There are already local groups opposing these zoning changes. Public money is limited and is restricted on how it can be used for countering these efforts and dispelling incorrect info. Is there assistance for communication, both in terms of expertise and funding, as well as help with the challenges of communicating by volunteer boards?
That's a great question, and we do recognize there's some opposition at the local level. There are also lots of groups that are out there that are supporting this effort. And we do have some new resources that are available to help with community organizing, frankly. It's not funding directly from my agency or for other executive agencies, but we have, there are 2 groups that exist that are trying to promote better communication and organizing to support 3A compliant districts and to support the conversation that are being had. There is a nonprofit organization called Abundant Housing Massachusetts. They will be working with communities to provide and with residents for to assist those residents to organize themselves to promote these districts. And then also there's another nonprofit called CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, and they will be launching a program in January to provide assistance to municipalities. And so whether you're a small town with a planner or a large city, they will be having an application process where they will be looking to assist communities, in particular with this difficulty of educating the public and communications around this new district. So thank you for asking that question. We haven't covered that too thoroughly in our technical assistance. So thanks, appreciate that.
All right, we just built 2 schools. MSBA required that the schools be built for projections that did not include these zoning changes. Is there coordination and additional funding for the future growth?
I'd be interested what community this question is coming from. Not sure if we can ask them to unmute and talk about their experience. You know, we obviously within state agencies, we coordinate across a whole variety of different kinds of funding sources and different kinds of regulations and requirements. Generally, the school age population in many communities is decreasing, and that is just a demographic fact as the baby boom generation's children are producing less children. But that does vary, and by community, there are some higher school communities, but many communities are actually facing decreasing school population and the potential consolidation of existing schools. So that is just generally my knowledge of demographics, but I know it does vary from community to community.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, MSBA absolutely did not take these projections into the school projections. So I'm not sure.
I don't know what. Yeah, Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Sarah, you know what the law requires is that you produce zoning. It is not a guarantee that the zoning will result in production. There's no production requirement in this law. So the requirement is to zone for multifamily, not to build it.
There is a provision, if you go the 40R route, there's a 40S provision for additional funding for school children, but it's a long, complex process. Okay, Mary.
I'm sorry, Karen, just to follow up on the 40S. So that is a provision that exists in concert with Chapter 40R to recognize that some municipalities were worried about changing their zoning and that it would impact their school population. There have been very few communities that can actually demonstrate that they had an impact to their school age population, and only less than 5 communities have ever received funding from Chapter 40S. So I think that is it is unfortunate, and of course it is a community concern about what's going to happen with school age population, but it is not always the result that upzoning property results in an increase in school age population. And that's borne out, frankly, by this lack of 40S funding, because when communities are asked to demonstrate it, they do not demonstrate. They cannot demonstrate it.
Excellent. Mary Jo said, got it, and thanks. And then finally, we have, thanks, Chris, to you and your team for putting out so many info sessions, webinars, and pieces of informational material. The program may seem complex, but your efforts to help everyone understand are greatly appreciated. And I concur with that. This is the second time I've seen you today on MBTA Communities. Let's see, no more questions at the end. I feel like it is disingenuous to say it is only zoning, not a production mandate. Why zone if you don't want anyone to build?
Of course, we want folks to build multifamily housing, and especially near transit or in communities that are adjacent to transit. But the requirement in the law is to produce the zoning. Of course, we want more housing to be built.
Awesome. That is the end of the questions. And I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And I hope you got your answers. If not, there's lots of information out there on DHCD's website, on MHP's website, and talk to your regional planning agencies. CPTC has several training sessions. So, and these slides will be emailed to you tomorrow. And thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Chris and Nate. And Katie.